In a small, sleepy town, people began to disappear without a trace. The police were baffled, unable to find any clues. It started with one person, then another, and soon it became a pattern. The townspeople began whispering about a shadow that crept through the streets at night, leaving nothing behind but fear and silence. They called him Deathman, for he was invisible in the day, but at night death followed in his wake. Deathman wasn't just any serial killer. His methods were calculated, precise, and chillingly quiet. He never left a single fingerprint, no sign of a struggle. His victims simply vanished only to be found later, their bodies posed in strange and eerie positions. Each victim had a small symbol carved into their skin, a scythe, signifying Deathman's signature. But what terrified people most was his silence. There were no screams, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as though he was a ghost. No one knew who he was. He could be anyone, a neighbor, a friend, or a stranger passing through. The town was gripped in fear, and curfews were set to keep people off the streets at night. But Deathman didn't care. He always found a way to reach his targets. One evening, a detective named Lucas Gray arrived in town. Known for solving high-profile murder cases, Lucas was determined to stop Deathman's killing spree. He began investigating each of the deaths, looking for patterns, for any small detail that the police may have missed. But as meticulous as Lucas was, he was always one step behind. One night, while Lucas was going over the files, he received a letter slid under his door. It was an invitation, a taunt. The letter simply read, "You think you can stop death? Meet me at midnight at the old factory." Lucas knew it was a trap, but he couldn't resist. If Deathman was challenging him, it meant he was close to catching him. Armed with a gun, he arrived at the abandoned factory just before midnight. The place was dark, cold, and eerily quiet. Shadows danced in the dim light from the broken windows, and the air was thick with tension. As Lucas entered the building, the door slammed shut behind him. His heart raced, but he kept his composure. He moved carefully through the factory, his gun drawn. Suddenly he heard a faint sound, a soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on metal. Lucas followed the sound, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, and then he saw him. A tall figure dressed in all black, his face hidden behind a white, expressionless mask. In his hand he held a knife. The figure stood perfectly still, just staring at Lucas. "Who are you?" Lucas demanded, raising his gun. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Then slowly, he raised his knife, pointing it directly at Lucas. "I'm Death," the figure whispered, his voice cold and hollow. Without warning, Deathman lunged at Lucas with lightning speed. Lucas fired his gun, but the bullets seemed to do nothing. They passed through the shadows as if Deathman wasn't even there. Panic surged through Lucas as he realized he was dealing with something far more terrifying than a man. Lucas tried to run, but Deathman was always just behind him, his footsteps silent, his presence suffocating. In a last-ditch effort, Lucas turned to face him, ready to fight to the end. But as Deathman stepped into the light, Lucas's blood ran cold. The face behind the mask was his own. Deathman smiled, his face now a twisted reflection of Lucas's own, and whispered, "You can't escape death, Lucas. You were always part of me." With one final slash of the knife, the factory went silent once again. The next morning, Lucas's body was found in the same factory, posed in the same eerie way as Deathman's previous victims. A small scythe symbol was carved into his chest, marking him as yet another victim of the silent executioner. And the town? The murders continued, the people still vanishing without a trace. Deathman was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. No one knew when he would strike next, but one thing was certain: once Deathman marked you, there was no escape. Deathman's legend grew, and people whispered about him in hushed tones, praying they would never hear his silent footsteps in the night.